Before diving into Goblin Slayer, I'd just like to open this video with a disclaimer. Goblin Slayer contains footage that may be too disturbing for some people. I've tried to be careful with the footage so as to not include anything too excessive, but if you're still worried, looking away and only listening is a perfectly viable option. That'll be it for the disclaimer, and now on to the video. Goblin Slayer is an anime about slaying goblins. That's a really bad way to start the video, but we're rolling with it anyways. I say that painfully obvious statement because at its core, that's what the anime is. But sometimes the anime is much more than just slaying goblins. It's about the details in its world building and the commitment to its titular character. But in other times, the anime is nothing more than just slaying goblins. It's about the repetition of a routine and the lack of significant variety. This video will be the first of two I'll be making on Goblin Slayer. This video will be covering the main anime, which aired back in October of 2018. The second video will be covering the film Goblin's Crown, which aired in February of 2020. Both of the videos will purely be discussing just the animated versions, so there won't be any spoilers from the light novel, manga adaptation, or the side stories. It should go without saying, but there will be spoilers for the Goblin Slayer anime in this video. There will also be some minor spoilers about the Goblin's Crown film. The first episode stands as one of the most infamous parts of Goblin Slayer. It generated a lot of, let's say, discussion when it first aired back in 2018. The online commotion is what got me to check out the first episode back then. I was initially disturbed by it, but I didn't bother finishing the anime at the time. Returning to it a couple years later, while I knew what to expect out of the first episode, the first few minutes of it were still painfully innocent for me. The anime clearly wants to have that dramatic shift from the innocent fantasy setting it first portrays itself into the dark, gritty, and violent story about the Slayer. The anime builds into the transition well with things like the worried look and statement from the guild girl to the unnamed warrior character swinging his sword around in excitement inside the cave. I found details like these to be more effective at building the mood of the episode than the more direct shots of things like the sign at the front of the cave. While people may debate the methods and efficacy of the opening, there is one thing that I've seen a lot of agreement on. The opening is clearly meant to establish the tone of the anime as incredibly dark. Despite the vibrant nature of the city and its bustling population, it's a very dangerous place out there, and some of the people in this world don't quite understand that concept, which leads to cases such as the members of the adventure group killed and assaulted in the opening to make this very point. The Slayer is someone that stands as a contrast to that facet of the world. As a side note, I know that the fighter girl was the main cause of discussion back in 2018. I feel enough has already been said about the scene, so there's very little I have to contribute on that discussion. The only thing I'll say is that if I were to write the scene again to accomplish the same goals, I would not go about it the same way. The perspective we are given for the story is through the lenses of the priestess viewing the Slayer's actions, but this perspective is very limited in the grand scheme of things. It's viewing a story that is only a small component in the Goblin Slayer world. The best part of the Goblin Slayer anime for me was the scale of its world building. Through various interactions and dialogue, the anime left the impression that there is genuinely a lot happening in the world that we never get to see because of our limited perspective. But the focus of the anime is not on that greater expanded world. Outside of the Slayer's party and people that directly interact with them, a lot is brought up but nothing is truly explored upon. As a result, the anime's world is very broad but not very deep. There's three of these aspects that really helped expand the world of Goblin Slayer in notable ways. The first of these starts with episode 3 when the elf ranger, the dwarf mage, and the lizard priest are properly introduced. All three members are from different races and they are distinct in both visual and personalities from one another. The most important difference between the three of them were the differences in language as shown by the different names they have for the Slayer. This in combination with the guild girl's mental observation about them adds to that feeling that there is more out there. There's at least 3 races that have yet to be fully explored in the context of the anime. Later on in the meeting room, there's talk of some conflict between the races, which hints at possibilities of various race relations in this world as well. The second aspect that expanded the world is the religious systems of Goblin Slayer. There's a variety of mentions of the religious forces that are present within this world, whether those be the chants used to cast spells and miracles, conversations about the gods such as the one right after the promotion exam in episode 5, and some of the cinematic storytelling sequences at the start of a few episodes. One character that especially stands out in this regard is the Swordmaiden. Before meeting the maiden, the anime speaks about a group of legendary heroes that fought against the demon lord, painting them as larger-than-life figures. It then turns out that the maiden was part of this group and is larger than life in more than one way. Furthermore, she's shown to be a significant figure in the religious hierarchy. Even though we only meet just one of the heroes, the maiden alone is enough to take what sounded like a legend leading up to that point and completely rewrite it as a real historical event. It also gets you wondering about all of the other heroes that were involved and if we would ever get to meet them. Turns out we don't, at least in the anime, but I don't think that any more of these heroes being introduced would have the same level of impact as the maiden because they would be treading the same ground that she does. The third aspect was possibly one of the greatest moments of realizations of the world's scale, and it comes pretty late in episode 10. In that episode, it's simply brought up that the resurrected Demon Lord had been defeated by a hero at the capital. Given that the Demon Lord was introduced pretty early in the anime, I naturally assumed that it was going to be the final boss. Because there was also mention of the Demon Lord having been defeated years before the events of the anime, I also assumed that the scenes with the 3 female adventurers were 3 out of the number of heroes that defeated the Demon Lord all those years ago. But once it's revealed that the Lord of present day had been defeated by the hero trio we saw a few times, all of the gears clicked into place and suddenly the scale of the world became that much more visualized. There is a much larger world out there with things constantly happening that we never get to fully see, all because of the limited perspective I discussed earlier. The ending monologue from the priestess really cements the fact that the Slayer story is just a small cog in a very large machine. There's 2 more details that added to the scale of the world that I want to briefly mention. The first is the hierarchical system within the goblins because it adds a bit more depth about how goblins function. The second is the variety of folklore and uncertain theories that surround the origin of goblins, these being told around the campfire in episode 3. To quickly insert a nitpick, I just want to say that I was a little disappointed to find out that goblins actually came from the moon. The moon story was one of the really far-reaching ones, but it was perfectly fine in the context of it being folklore. When it turned out to be true, it felt kinda silly. The scale of the world presented in the Goblin Slayer anime is broad but not deep. There's mention of things like the different races, religious figures, and heroes, but none of these are significantly explored outside of the Swordmaiden. In most cases, I would say that it would be better to have a less broad but deeper world and to fully explore just a few parts of that world instead of spreading yourself too thin. That being said, let me immediately contradict myself by saying that the anime is still fine with having a world that is broader than it is deeper. The anime focuses on just one storyline and builds on just that one instead of flying all over the place trying to micromanage a whole bunch of sub-stories. Every time some new aspect of the world is brought up, it's done in a way that makes it interesting and adds to the scale of the world without detracting from the main story too much. The Slayer story is deep but not broad, so even though the world is broad but not deep, that's still perfectly okay. There's one piece of criticism I've seen brought up in a few reviews about the anime. Goblins are illustrated as these menaces to society that attack villages and assault women. Despite this track record, the inhabitants of this world, with the exception of a very few, do not consider goblins to be a serious threat. The criticism I've seen in some of the reviews is that people failing to recognize goblins as a legitimate threat despite their records is a critical flaw in the world building of the anime. I have to say that I disagree with this piece of criticism. At its core, it's a matter of perspective. We talked briefly about the limited perspective of the priestess viewing the Slayer's actions. Outside of this, the only other major perspective we get is that of the farm girl viewing the Slayer when he's back at the ranch. Both the priestess and the farm girl are fully aware of what goblins are capable of. The priestess witnessed it herself in the first episode, and the Slayer directly tells it to the farm girl in episode 11. Outside of them and the Slayer, the only living characters that are confirmed to know the capability of goblins are the guild girl, the Swordmaiden, and the rest of the Slayer's party. Specifically speaking, the Slayer and the Maiden have past traumas associated with goblins, which leads them to be 2 of the most anti-goblin characters in the anime. But outside of the aforementioned characters, besides these 2, no one else is understanding of their respective stories. The Maiden's character arc is wholly built around that fact. Almost the entirety of the anime is told from the perspective of people that know the potential danger of goblins, but this is an incredibly limited sample size. Our access to the perspectives of the anime gives us insight into how goblins behave, but not everyone else in the anime does because most people don't have a real reason to intently focus on goblins. Goblins rank very low on the overall list of threats because of the prevalence of other greater threats. The anime gives us at least 4 more of these greater threats. The Demon Lord, the demons that operate underneath the Lord, the Ogre, and the Tentacle Eye Surprise in the ruins under Watertown. I'm sure in the light novel there are even more than just these. As seen by adventurer reactions whenever new quests are posted, with the exception of the Slayer, adventurers always go for the high-profile ones, and the quests related to things like sewer rats and goblins are rather unpopular, which is easily believable. I don't recall if this is explicitly stated in the anime, but it should naturally make sense that the higher profile quests are associated with higher prestige and reward, hence their greater popularity. Furthermore, goblins are shown to be individually pathetic creatures. It's when they outnumber and overwhelm the unprepared individual or party that they finally become a serious threat. I think that when you combine the limited perspective the story provides, the establishment of threats greater than goblins, and the weakness of individual goblins, it should provide a sufficient explanation as to why I disagree with the criticism of goblins not being considered a greater threat. To play devil's advocate a bit, what about the bigger goblins? Things like the champions, lords, and in the case of Goblin's Crown, paladins. These types of goblins are much stronger than their normal counterparts, I'm not going to deny that. The champion fight in episode 7 is a phenomenal example of how strong these matured goblins can be. However, remember that for every one goblin shaman, champion, or lord, there are many normal goblins that are still individually pathetic. The larger types of goblins are the exception, they are not the rule. As someone who disagrees with that criticism, I can only guess that it stems from viewing Goblin Slayer with a narrow perspective. I think that criticism makes 100% sense if it was stated that knowledge about goblin capabilities was commonly known amongst the people of this world. I think that criticism also makes 100% sense if we only take into consideration the Slayer party's experiences. But zooming out and looking at the big picture was everything I needed to know to disagree with that specific criticism. Moving on from all things related to the enemy's world, let's start talking about the action. A lot of the action in the anime can't even be described as action because it's just a Slayer completely destroying goblins with a very ineffective retaliation from the goblins' behalf. While the precise and mathematical approach the Slayer has in killing off the packs of goblins is cool for the first 2 or 3 times, it does get pretty samey as the anime goes on. The addition of the party members helps a lot in adding a little more variety to the encounters with new tricks up each member's sleeves. It's also good that every single member of the party is useful and contributes something to every encounter, and that it's not just the Slayer completely hard carrying every single one. But the anime is still called Goblin Slayer, and it always does as the title says. Because of the precise approach the Slayer has when it comes to killing goblins, the stakes in a lot of encounters get lowered for the most parts, and none ever come back to the really dark tones of the cave encounter in episode 1. The surgical elimination of goblins is far too clean for the most part for regular goblins to truly pose a threat to the party on their own. The goblins just don't stand a chance. The concept of stakes implies that there is something at risk of being lost should the encounter go bad. Episode 1's stakes were tied to the lives of the novice party, most of which were lost. Outside of a few irrelevant characters and the Slayer getting knocked around from time to time, very little actually feels at stake in many of the encounters of Goblin Slayer. The only time the stakes were raised outside of episode 1 was in episode 7, where the champion wrecks the Slayer and the party gets overwhelmed. I think this comes close to the level of stakes in episode 1, but it's not quite there. The stakes tied to the Horde encounter in episodes 11 and 12 should be massive, at least in the context of this story, but I think the execution is too clean for anything to feel at risk. The shields with the tortured girls tied to them is a really dark twist that ends up being nothing more than shock value instead of anything substantially contributed to the fight. The sleeping spells are just too effective at leaving the goblins vulnerable. The reveal later that the Slayer and the adventurers already knew about the existence of these shields takes even more impact out of the shock value. While the background tied to the Goblin Lord is interesting, the Lord himself is less visually impressive compared to the Ogre or champions we've already seen. Because it doesn't have the same weight visually, the fight itself is not boring, but it's not that great either, if that makes sense. We've seen the Slayer get challenged before by ogres and champions, so him being brought down again isn't anything new. The creative usage of the protection spells is cool, and the Lord trying to beg the priestess for mercy is a neat twist, but the Lord encounter was overall really underwhelming for me. Because the fundamental core of the anime's action is all about stabbing, shooting, slashing, and smashing down goblins, it actually leaves very little room for flexibility against them. The anime tries 2 things to spice up these encounters. The first are the various arenas these encounters take place in. Each individual location that the goblins are fought in are different enough from one another so things are visually fresh each time, but the arenas can only contribute so much to the action, so this freshness doesn't last long. A special shout out goes to the sewers underwater town when the goblins start coming in on boats. This was by far the funniest moment in the anime for me. The second and far more effective way that the anime adds variety to its encounters is something we briefly talked about, those being the bigger goblins that have reached different levels of maturity. Visually speaking, they are still rather goblin-y, with the exception of the Lord and the Paladin from Goblin's Crown, but each one is clearly displayed to be of different power levels from one another, as we see with how the Slayer gets thrashed from time to time against things like the Ogre and the Champion. Variants that aren't based on sheer size like the Riders and the Shamans are also welcome additions, although I think the Riders in particular could have been used more. These different kinds of goblins add newer tools and techniques from the goblins' behalf to make the encounters more interesting from their side. These would be things like the Ogre's Fireball spell or the giant weapons wielded by the champions in the final Horde encounter. Since we've talked so much about how the goblins are being killed, let's now move on to the people that are actually doing the killing. We'll save the Slayer for last because I have more to talk about him, so let's quickly run through some of the other characters. The priestess provides not a completely neutral, but an untouched perspective to view the Slayer through when he's in action. She has an untouched perspective in the sense that while the Slayer asks for help, she just lets him run around and do his own business for the most part because she knows that he knows better. It's the lack of significant interference in his actions that's important for her. This perspective is important because the anime is mainly about the Slayer, and her perspective doesn't paint him as somebody that he really isn't. The elf archer having that moment where she thinks about the expectations of adventure versus the grim reality of what has to be done is an interesting twist to her character. The lizard priest eventually wanting to become a dragon is a really unique motivation that adds more background to the lizardmen race as a whole. The bit about the cheese was funny the first time, but it really overstays its welcome. Like a little too much, honestly. As for the dwarf mage, I have nothing to say about him, so sorry for all of the dwarf mage fans out there. The party members have decent banter, even though it gets a little repetitive with the elf and dwarf getting into squabbles. Personality-wise, there's nothing special out of them. But hey, the elf is canonically 2,000 years old, so I'm sure some people are really happy about that one. The farm girl is the classic trope of the childhood friend who sticks with the protagonist after all of these years. She's another somewhat untouched perspective to view the Slayer through for whenever he's out of action, and this is good for the same reasons the priestess's perspective was good. Despite her optimism, there's something rather sad about the way that she thinks about things, and it makes her just that little bit more interesting, since outside of dialogue she is mostly prime fanservice material. The introduction to the Slayer is undeniably really fucking cool, starting with the trademark eye glow to the brutally efficient and cold-hearted way that he wipes out the goblins in the cave. The scene where he kills the goblin children at the end of one still makes me a little sick when I see it, but I think it's the best example of illustrating that efficient and cold-hearted attitude he has towards goblins. All of the details that go into his choices of armor and weapons are another solid example. His backstory is good and gives him a very believable motivation as to why he does what he does, and the presentation of it in episode 2 is pretty solid. The foreshadowing at the start of the episode softens the impact it could have had by a tiny bit, but that doesn't really matter in the long run. Despite his near permanently stoic state, there's some subtle signs of development with him growing to care more about his fellow party mates. From episode 2 with the farm girl, he was shown to not be a completely uncaring person, but the important bit is that the circle of people he cares about expands. The guild hall scene in episode 11 where the Slayer is willing to put everything he has on the line to protect the farm is a really nice scene in this sense, even though it is a little cheesy with everyone rallying up together. One of the best facets of his character is not anything he does, but rather the things people say about him. The guild girl, the uncle at the farm, the purple witch, or other random adventurers all have different things to say about the Slayer, while the Slayer himself has very little to say. It's one of those cases where despite us knowing exactly what he does and why he does it, there's still some mystery surrounding the character, and I really like that. His consistently stoic approach to any matter with little regard of outside opinion nicely adds to building out his character. Regardless of the stakes at hand, if there are no goblins involved, the Slayer isn't bothered by it. The best example of this would be in episode 3 where the elf asks for his help in defeating the Demon Lord and the Slayer declines because he doesn't care about the Demon Lord since goblins are more important. However, he becomes immediately willing to cooperate once the lizard priest mentions goblins. I applaud the choice to dedicate almost all of the Slayer's actions towards goblin slaying, but I think it breaks past being impressively dedicated and into being hilarious at certain times. The episode 3 example highlights that a lot because of the sudden shift in his attitude once goblins are introduced to the equation. His refusal to take off armor at almost all times is another example of this. Clearly, this side of his character is played up from time to time in order to enable some of the comedic moments, but I have no clue as to whether or not it's supposed to be as funny as often as it is. It peaked for me in episode 4 when the ogre appears and I half expected the Slayer to simply walk away because he wasn't a goblin. My guess is that I find some of the Slayer's completely deadpan attitude and actions to be hilarious because his unreal commitment to goblin slaying sometimes makes him feel out of touch with reality and stick out like a sore thumb from all of the other characters. I think that the parts of sometimes being out of touch and sticking out are supposed to be intentional to make the Slayer more distinct, but I think that it is occasionally overdone and breaks the immersion. Most of this part of the Slayer gets better as the anime goes on, and there are less immersion-breaking levels of anti-goblin sentiment with more fleshed-out story arcs to follow. The importance of immersion varies from person to person just as much as it varies from genre to genre. Genres like horror will typically want higher levels of immersion to make the most out of its atmosphere and tension. Genres like comedies don't really need immersion because jokes can still be funny even if the person isn't entirely sold on the story or the atmosphere of the anime. I think that fantasies like Goblin Slayer is a genre where immersion is important. Because fantasies take place in settings and revolve around conflicts that are typically much different from our day-to-day lives, having the reader or viewer be immersed in the story and atmosphere is an effective way to get away with things that make sense in the context of the fantasy world, but not so much from our realistic viewpoints. I think Goblin Slayer has some successful elements of immersion. The first episode is really good in this sense because the sudden transition is a good way to hook someone in, and the Slayer's appearance gives you that oh shit feeling as things are going to start ramping up. The broad scale of the world is another good element of immersion because it adds more and more things for the viewer to think about and build their image of the world they don't see. I've seen reviews compare Goblin Slayer to Dungeons & Dragons a lot. I have very little experience and knowledge about D&D, so I can't agree with confidence, but I can see where this comparison comes from. In my notes, I compared it to a video game, which I think is a similar enough comparison to D&D. But some of the factors of the anime that enables this comparison were those that contributed to breaking my sense of immersion. The first case of this was with the magic system in Goblin Slayer. Spells are simply called by very generic names, and the anime mentions details such as being granted new spells and the number of casts available. I don't mind things like the names and the acquisition of new spells because, really, how else would you effectively replace the two things those accomplish? I think that the number of casts being a repeated concept takes it one step too far in trying to establish the fantasy aspect of the anime with a developed system of magic. The main issue I have with it is that there is no explanation as to why this system exists. While not everything in an anime or just any stories in general need to be contextualized to fit the world, when something is mentioned repeatedly such as the limited number of casts, I think giving it context is important as to why it's being brought up again and again. Without this context or explanation, the limitation to spellcasting feels like it was slapped on top of an already established system that didn't need those limitations. Whenever characters directly refer to how many spells they have left, it stretches the immersion because they're referring to something that isn't properly contextualized and feels out of place. This detail may even be one of those things that is covered in the light novel at some point that either didn't get written into the anime or that it never gets to a point that explains it. What's frustrating is that the anime does contextualize the limited number of spells for one person, the Lizard Priest. The priest's spells were tied to using bone shards as an offering, which sort of simulates a resource system like mana or stamina you could find in an RPG. Different spells also cost different amounts of shards, which is just like in games where different abilities typically cost different amounts of mana. The shards didn't require the anime to take a lot of time to explain. We see the priest offer those shards when he casts a spell, and it immediately makes sense and contextualizes his limitations. More things like these that can visually indicate the limited number of spells not only provides explanations for these limits, but also doesn't strain the immersion. I think the limitations of spells were added as a forced way of creating tension in combat encounters. The finite number of casts forces tension by limiting the resources that are available to the party. By itself, handicapping a protagonist is not a bad way to create additional tension in a fight. However, when most goblins are already complete pushovers when alone, combat encounters can only really be made more interesting by making them stronger rather than making the party weaker. This is why the encounters in episodes 1 and 7 work. In episode 1, the goblins outnumber and overwhelm the party. In episode 7, the champion is far stronger than a lot of the other enemies we've seen, and it also repeats the concept of goblins overwhelming the main party. The second main example of gamey tropes damaging the immersion is in the names of the characters. There are never any actual names mentioned, everyone just has a title or nickname. The priestess is always the girl, the elf is always the elf, the dwarf and lizard priest are always the dwarf and lizard priest. The slayer would be the best example because he has 3 nicknames, Goblin Slayer, Orc Bolg, or Beard Cutter. We're simply stuck with referring to the characters through class or race, which means that despite any characterization that may happen, we always refer to them by those rudimentary titles that feel more suited to NPCs in an RPG rather than a story with actual characters. In a way, it depersonalizes these characters. A minor example that is nowhere near as impactful as the names or the spell system are the references to potions. Potions are simply called health and stamina potions, which again carries those video gamey vibes. This issue could easily be resolved by making up just a more colorful name for these potions. When something becomes too reliant on trying to live up to the genre, it can be damaging, just like in the case of Goblin Slayer's Immersion. All of these problems could have been solved with just a bit more specificity, more varied ways of displaying the limited number of spellcasts, appropriate names for the characters that aren't just shallow titles, even things like coming up with more creative names for potions. In their generic states, these facets of the Goblin Slayer anime don't feel like part of an actual story or a world, but rather very basic elements in a video game. To end this video, I just have a few more things I want to briefly mention that I couldn't find an appropriate place earlier on to talk about. Having to do a chant for every single spellcast gets really tedious after the first few times. To the anime's credit, literally every single person who casts a spell has to do a chant, even the ogre, so it's established and maintained as a consistent piece of the magic system in Goblin Slayer. The anime also never uses the time it takes to chant out a spell as an excuse for them getting attacked, which I fully expected to happen after I realized that these chants would happen for almost every single instance of a spellcast. The truth about the Swordmaiden revealed at the end of episode 9 is a good way to reframe the events of the last few episodes. It recontextualizes the happenings of those episodes and also adds to the maiden's character and her dilemma. There's two shots in the anime that I thought were really good. The single shot in episode 7 where it pauses the action to do the 360 spin around the Slayer with the goblin corpses flying around him is really cool. The shot at the end of episode 10 with the goblin footprints in the dirt is really great. It takes the Slayer's daily routine that we've become very familiar with by this point and changes it in a way that arrests your attention and sets the tone for what's about to come, all within a few seconds. It also helps that episode 10 is a very quiet episode with no action whatsoever, so the footprints at the end create an even more dramatic shift in tone. Combo that with the farm girl's monologue about the uncertainty of the future, and it's easily my favorite single shot in both the anime and the movie. Goblin Slayer's fatal flaw is that the expectations set from the start of the first episode were never truly lived up to again. In a generally ideal sense, a story should ramp up in tension and grow increasingly immersive as it goes on until it hits a climax near the end before it resolves. But because Goblin Slayer peaked far too soon and the rest of the story wasn't able to return to that, the flaws in the action and immersive elements become much more noticeable. While the ending is fine, it's quite nice and wholesome, I still feel that the anime wasn't able to deliver on everything that it could've. So that's it for Goblin Slayer. This video turned out to be longer than I expected, which isn't a problem for me, but I know that longer videos don't appeal to everybody. The next video on Goblin's Crown should be out soon and hopefully be shorter than this one. The script of it is ready and all I need to do is just record and then get through the editing process. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking it and checking out some of my other content. I have videos both shorter and longer than this one. If those seem good to you as well, then please consider subscribing, especially if you're interested in hearing about Goblin's Crown soon. That'll be everything from me, so thanks for watching.